Good morning to all, and thank you for the opportunity to give us to attend the Congreso Internacional de CESPE 2023. Our intervention concerns the gender injustice and human trafficking, the colonizing thinking against the pedagogy of cruelty. At the international level, we cannot think of gender-based violence and human trafficking in a manner unrelated to the robbery economic structures typical of the colonial and modern way of interacting with the world. To support their power, which show a lack of empathy among individuals and give rise to a pedagogy of cruelty, in according to the thinking of Rita Segado. They are reflections that speak of Latin America, but also can be applicable to the Italian public sphere. Gender violence can be distinguished in criminal violence and economic violence. Criminal violence generates an escalation of feminicide, or better, femicide, as Rita Segado reminds us. Economic violence, on the other hand, involves trafficking human beings, women, girls, children, who are sold and generate an economy based on prostitution and enslavement. These alliances between economic powers and criminal powers are spread globally and give rise to a new colonialism, a process of permanent colonization to the detriment of the poorest countries, of the poorest sections of the population, with little access to health and education. This is a pedagogy of cruelty that normalize the barbarism. Our problem, our scientific problem, is investigating the gender violence, not just a private matter. Rapes, feminicide, stalking, abuse and trafficking are phenomena to be anchored in a public and political sphere in order to understand the meaning that binds all these acts. As Rita Segato teaches us, in order to understand gender-based violence, it is necessary to deprive it, recognizing in it an historical and cultural matrix rooted in the colonial mentality of modernity. La pedagogías de la crueldad a todos los actos y prácticas que enseñan, habitúan y programan a los sujetos a transmutar lo vivo y su vitalidad en cosas. En ese sentido, esta pedagogía enseña algo que va mucho más a la del matar. Enseña a matar de una muerte desritualizada, de una muerte que deja apenas residuos en lugar del difunto. La trata y la explotación sexual practicadas en estos días son los más perfectos ejemplos y al mismo tiempo alegorías de lo que quiero decir con pedagogía de la crueldad. Es posible que eso explique el hecho de toda empresa extractivista que se establece en los campos y pequeños pueblos de América Latina para producir commodities destinadas al mercado global. Al instalarse, trae consigo, o es inclusive predecida por burdeles y el cuerpo cosa de las mujeres que allí se ofrecen. Colonialist thought is imbued with the high-intensity patriarchy, in which the male becomes the one who reduces all differences to himself and conceptualizes every diversity as inferiority. The discourse of the coloniality of the modern era, despite being present as egalitarian, hide within it a binary paradigm. men versus women, good versus bad, light versus darkness, public versus private. The binarism determines the existence of a universe whose truths are given as a universal, while in reality they emanate from the male figure, and what is different from the male standard is conceived as marginal and minority, unimportant. This binary structure, typical of modernity, is violent and oppressive because it does not give voice to differences. First of all the gender difference. We can oppose to this totalitarianism a vision of the other that Seyla Benhabib calls the concrete other, or other incarnate beings. That is the understanding of the other in its diversity, not reduced to an impersonal self. The view of the other generalized requires us to see each individual as a rational being who has the same rights and duties that we assume for ourselves. Assuming this perspective, which is typical of modern enlightenment, we abstain from the individuality and concrete identity of the other, so that the other, just like us, is a being who has concrete needs. What constitutes his moral dignity, therefore, is not what makes it different from us, but what makes it equal to us, namely its rationality. This is typical of the male perspective. The perspective of the other concrete, the concrete other, on the other hand, requires us to see every rational being with a concrete history, an actual and emotional identity, values and culture different from our own. And this is a typical female perspective. In accordance with the modern and binary colonial scheme, any element necessary to achieve ontological fullness will have to be measured according to the standard of the colonizer. In this way, any manifestation of otherness is a problem. Decolonizing the concept typical of modernity which underpin philosophical and pedagogical thinking. It is necessary to make the concept of gender acquire a theoretical and epistemological status, capable of deconstructing the acquired concept and data to be associated with the Eurocentric culture as the idea of equality, citizenship, and rights. Which episteme generated the concept of race, femininity, masculinity, etc.? According to this vision of the world, the body of women is assimilated to territory, to resources, an object of conquest on which colonial power is exercised.
Based on these reflections, we asked ourselves whether it is possible to read the phenomenon of trafficking in women through the lens of critical pedagogy and decolonial feminism. We therefore set two general objectives. Firstly, to provide a reflection on trafficking in women through the lens of decolonial feminist critical pedagogy. The second goal is to determine whether it is possible to read trafficking in women as an attempt by colonized men to re-establish their territorial dominance over women's bodies and the social symbolic system. After presenting the phenomenon of trafficking in women and girls, our intention is to point out how trafficking contains the key characteristics of colonialism understood is a complex and intersectional phenomenon where the different spheres of coloniality operate simultaneously as multiple oppression, investing the totality of the human existence of the victims, the traffickers, and society. To do this, we will draw on the theories of decolonial feminism of Segato, Lugones, and Walsh, relating them to the critical pedagogy of Freire and Bellux. Given Rita Segato's decolonial feminist theory, we will identify in the mandate of masculinity the key factor of patriarchy as a particular way of structuring collective life that generates violence as a social fact. If the mandate of masculinity entails the social construction of a subject who is obliged to acquire and perpetuate a masculine status under the constant control of his peers, violence cannot be understood as an individual act, as it obeys the mandate of the male corporation. This mandate is at the heart of the socialization operated by the educational systems of modern nation states, which are based on the parameters of the recognition of prevailing colonial, heteropatriarchal, and class relations, practicing what Segato calls a pedagogy of cruelty. In fact, with Lugones, we agree with the theoretical framework that sees the reinterpretation of colonial capitalist modernity on the axis of gender coloniality, which identifies in the intersection of gender, class, race, a central construct of the capitalist power system, thus denying the possibility of a separation between the three dimensions and seeing gender as a colonial normative construction, racially differentiated and fictitious like the category of race. If the intertwining of coloniality and gender relations is supported by Segato, what the Argentine anthropologist asks is a different gender organization imposed by colonization. With colonization, in fact, colonial gender relations have been imposed on existing ones, generating a patriarchal entanglement that reinforces the oppression of women who suffer a loss of political power and greater subjugation. Women are understood as an externality of racialized men and forced to internalize a new organization of social life in which they occupy positions of inferiority compared to before and compared to the white man, the ideal of civilization and expression of full humanity. With the colonization, in fact, the hierarchy of prestige established in the ancestral patriarchy is lost, as colonized men lost possession of the land as well as the political power exercised over the territory, and the woman's body becomes a battlefield on which the insignia of victory are nailed. Colonization produced what Quijano defines as a coloniality of power, based on the idea of race and the control of labor around capital and the work market, exercised through a coloniality of being and thought. Can we therefore read trafficking in women as an attempt by colonized men to re-establish their territorial dominance over women's bodies and the social symbolic system? Trafficking in human beings, women and minors, is the epiphenomenon, the highest manifestation of commodification from a colonial perspective in the light of Rita Segato's theories. In non-European countries, where most trafficked women and girls come from and which have a history of colonialism and decolonization, machismo and gender-based violence can be considered an extension of the colonialist mentality embedded in the thoughts and actions of the oppressed subjects, who in turn became oppressors, as victims of that cultural and symbolic violence that leads to internalizing the patterns of oppression and discrimination and making them the starting point for activating violent reappropriation dynamics. In the phenomenon of trafficking, the link between gender-based violence as a constitutive element of value extraction and the centrality of social reproduction in social and economic organization is central. As Maldonado Torres states, what the coloniality of being highlights is not ontological violence, but is the discretionary character of violence. The victims carefully chosen in marginality represent the reconquest of power through the commodification and possession, physical and symbolic, of human beings, as a consequence of the capitalist exploitation of some social groups, whites and owners, over others, racialized and dispossessed. This demonstrates that the imposition and internalization of the process of colonial dehumanization are the result of long-lasting processes based on the creation of alliances between colonizing and colonized men. Trafficking human beings is characterized by a state of continuous subjection of victims, understood as a systematic and profound abnormality of the emotional setup, such as to generate a state of powerlessness and absence of possible alternatives in the near future, and a flawed consent to submission, and by the exploitation exerted on the reduced capacity for self-determination of the victims. Victims are chosen from areas of social marginalization, economic and educational poverty, underdevelopment, social and economic inequalities, family breakdown, gender discrimination, and adult irresponsibility. As Save the Children states, countries with a larger gender gap in access to education, health, and economic status have a larger presence of modern slavery. Moreover, recruitment is mainly by a family member, demonstrating the social and educational origin of the phenomenon and the worrying normalization of sexism, racism, and classism that connote patriarchal culture. The colonial mindset deprives certain groups of people of an awareness of their rights, preventing them from accessing quality education or perpetuating patriarchal culture and gender factors through epistemological, academic, and disciplinary perspectives imbued with coloniality. Often women and girls involved in trafficking suffer this mentality by making it their own, ending up considering it normal or necessary to be mistreated and trafficked. At the societal level, such a colonial mentality prevents victims from emerging, as misrecognition of victim status is likely or risk factors are present in the family or community. As several researchers show, victims remain in a condition of invisibility due both to the numerous prejudices and stereotypes linked to trafficking, which often ascribe it to the dimension of deep-rooted taboo and to the widespread unawareness of their condition. Affecting the inability to recognize themselves as victims are psychological challenges stemming from the link with the exploiter, who uses means of control and coercive methods aimed at destroying the person's psychological and physical defenses, creating feelings of dependence and gratitude, and limiting their chance of escape. Victims of sexual exploitation may develop a sense of identity based on the perception of themselves as dirty, powerless, guilty, inhuman, and not deserving of love, leading them to define themselves almost only in relation to the traumatic experience where they find the motivation of their belonging. The traffickers, therefore, impose a certain condition of subalternity on the victims, exercising the mandate of masculinity in connection with modern capitalist logics, which impose the appropriation of nature, human and non-human, at low cost, the circulation of goods, their immoderate use, and their exploitation to the point of their total destruction, in order to pursue the sole objective of profit outside of any ethical constraints, as a demonstration of the capacity to reappropriate physical and symbolic spaces. Violence being inherent in the pedagogy of cruelty, and thus being a social fact, we need to focus on the link between pedagogy and decolonization.
Our proposal of militant research are educate to an alternative visions to the domination of the heart and the body, and problematizing language and roles. a focus on eco-pedagogy of the heart and bodies, exit from binarism, and enhancement of differences and concrete other, addressing the issue of minorities. Colonial thought is a system of power immune to good ideas and working continuously for the material, sexual, reproductive, economical, political, and cultural subjugation of women and minorities. The problem is both epistemic and understanding and the construction of those concepts that have become part of the dominant culture, but also of will and desire for change toward this paradigm, which is presented to us as the only possible. So is important the conscientization and militancy. Gender-based violence is more than a feminist issue. It is also a question of democracy, tolerance, and respect for fundamental human rights. It is also requires a rethinking of the economy that does not give rise to social relationship based on exploitation. Thank you for your attention. We remain available for any clarification through the emails. Adios.
Thank you for your attention. It was an honor to participate in this important conference. See you next time.